Hello, everyone. This is Samuel Brenton bringing you an exciting webinar in coordination with the Union of Concerned Scientists Science Network. Today we're going to be talking about, so what do you do exactly, how to talk about the value of your research. To do that, we have two pretty spectacular panelists who are going to provide us a little bit of perspective on just what they see as tools and best practices when communicating about what we all spend all those hours in the lab doing, that all-important research. First up will be Tom DeLagarto. He's a meteorologist and science communicator and is currently a meteorologist with the Innovem working at the Climate Prediction Center, CPC, inside the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. He acts as a consulting meteorologist for NOAA's climate.gov, writing articles about weather and climate events and putting them into a climate perspective. He's also a member of CPC's ENSO team, which is forecasting the strength of developing El Niños and La Niñas, a critically important piece of information. Fascinatingly, Tom was also named America's first Scientist Idol in 2013 after winning a competition held at the annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And since then, he has been given well-received humorous and informal science talks on weather and climate across the U.S. Also with us today will be Kellen Marshall. Kellen is a native Chicagoan and is currently a doctoral candidate of ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Her research focuses on the intersection between nature and cities and equitable distribution of nature's benefits. She has used her love of nature to communicate with the public through multiple platforms, including writing for Ebony.com and The Defender. She has hosted her own radio show titled Living Healthy, Living Green, and most recently began producing science content for a web series she hosts called Living Chicago. And I am serving as your host. My name is Samuel Brenton. I recently completed my graduate degrees in nuclear engineering and policy from MIT and now serve leading a nuclear waste management policy program at the Bipartisan Policy Center. I'll be here to help you with any of those questions and answers and making sure that we run smoothly. But for now, let's turn it over to Tom to get us started. Tom?
Thank you very much, Samuel. And thank you for having me. I'm going to talk a little bit now about this idea of how do we communicate our science in a way that people actually will not only listen to us for more than a few seconds, but also remember what we said. So once upon a time there was a scientist, yes. First, taking a look just a little bit more about myself. How to communicate your science effectively is not an easy question. It's not an easy task. The ability, to break down your science into something understandable to the public is not innate. It's something that has to be worked at. Now, I've given science talks to a wide variety of public audiences. At this, which they actually used me to advertise. They didn't tell me about it, but they used me to advertise for it. This conference, Verge, I was invited to talk about weather extremes and climate change to a very tech-oriented crowd. Meanwhile, here in Washington, D.C., I was also invited to talk about, this is a photo taken of me describing the beginning of the field of epidemiology. So as you can imagine, incredibly different crowds with incredibly different viewpoints and backgrounds, which means you have to change up your technique for communicating. And you have to remember, these crowds don't necessarily have any interest in what I was trying to say. So the idea here is, how do we communicate our science to people who may not have any interest whatsoever in what we're trying to say, besides just formalities that, oh, you're in front of me and we're having a conversation. So first, because I'm a scientist, and I'm sure there's a lot of scientists on the call, I figured I'd start with the most classic of scientist tropes, an outline slide. So as you can imagine here, I made the effort here to change the text of this outline slide to normally how the audience reacts to it. It's kind of a dull thing now. So we don't want to do that just off the bat. We don't want to do that when we're thinking of trying to communicate our science, because oftentimes this is how we imagine our outline slide and our science presentations going. We provide valuable insights, a thought-provoking conclusion, and it ends with a standing ovation. But oftentimes, if you've been to any scientific conference, if you've been not only speaking or if you've been actually in the crowd, you know that for the most part, people are just checking their emails on their phones. So let's avoid this whatsoever, and just focus on the simplest and most effective way to communicate. And it should not be surprising. It's to tell a story. Stories are powerful because when done right, a good story can basically embed itself into the listener, to the point where the listener almost thinks it's their own experience. Now, I don't know if anyone's like me, but how often have you heard a really engrossing story from a friend and then months later, not even realizing it, tell the exact same story to that exact same friend who's basically would then tell you like, oh, that was me. I told you that story. That's the quintessential moment of why it's a good story. It embedded itself into your own experience. A good story can do that. Now, stories have obviously worked forever. And humans are natural storytellers. I should note that most of our conversations as people, even if you're a scientist, even if you don't think you're a storyteller, is about stories. It's personal stories. It's gossip. From cave paintings, from Greek mythology to modern storytelling, this formula works. This idea of telling a story to get people interested in you, to listen to you, it works. Now, when we're talking about telling a story, what we're really talking about is developing a narrative. Now, a narrative has a beginning and a middle and an end. Obviously, I'm not breaking much new ground here with this idea. It's a simple concept, developing a narrative for how you talk about science. It's simple, but it's very hard to master. Not all narratives, just because you develop a narrative, just because you develop a story about your science, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be interesting. As well, seasons 1 through, well, basically every season of 2.5 Men can attest to, just developing a story does not mean it's interesting or funny or good to listen to. So how can we develop a good and interesting story about our science? Here can be some simple tips, and not only simple tips, but simple things to think about when you're in the process of developing your story. The first is the beginning. Your beginning should make an entrance. You want to grab the audience's attention from the get-go. Nowadays, people have plenty of gadgets, plenty of other things to be looking at besides paying attention to you. You have to basically prove to them why what you're saying is important or why they should invest their time in actually spending it listening to you. So how do we make an entrance? People, we generally understand the main concept here with this. It's you can do it with humor. If you don't find yourself particularly funny, that's fine. A personal experience or an anecdote, something that can connect to the readers on a fundamental level. If you can have some sort of story that's particular to you but universal to a universal experience to your audience, they're more likely to say, oh, that's interesting. That's something that reflects in me. I understand that position. I'm curious how this affected him, where this will go. Or you can just basically start it with a provocative question or an idea. But it's something that you have to grab them within the first minute or so of what you're trying to talk about. Otherwise, you're more likely to see their eyes glaze over. They're going to turn their head to their phone or their computer, and they're going to start sending emails. And this is important because after the beginning of your talk is where we get into the middle of your talk. After that, that's a very beginning and then the middle. The middle is really where you're trying to describe what your actual science is, the value of your science, trying to get across why what you're saying is important, why the work that you do is important. This is where you build the tension. This is where you're trying to show, all right, we grabbed their attention in the beginning. Now they're invested in this story. I'm basically going to try and keep building the tension so they're getting further and further onto the edge of their seat until we reach the conclusion, we reach the climax of your science story, why it's important, and then basically we can finish with the conclusion. The idea here is you're trying to get in the problems that you're trying to solve, the problems you had in solving your initial question, your successes, the interesting or important things that you found, the surprising things that popped up. And this is an important thing because oftentimes, especially when I'm doing a talk or I'm hearing other people when they're talking about how they're having trouble creating their own talks, is this idea that they're afraid they cannot connect to the listener or that they're dumbing something down. Now, an easy way to connect to anyone is to show vulnerability, to show that you're omnipotent. Scientists have this stereotype that we're basically these, we think of this idea that we know so much, we're geniuses. This idea that, well, we have our own problems. There's questions that have been left unanswered somewhat that we're trying to solve, that we've actually gone down the wrong path and had to learn something along the way. The surprising thing, the thing that changed our mindset, these are all experiences that, well, I'm sure we've all experienced when we're actually doing our research. These are quintessential human experiences. that people have done no matter what job they do. They've all experienced these emotions. And if they can connect to you on a human level, as dehumanizing you, they're much more likely to listen to you because you're not going to be seen as above them. You're not going to be seen as being pedantic, trying to lecture them. You're just basically a human being who likes science, just like other human beings like whatever they do for their living or whatever their hobbies are related to. Now, these are these emotions that everyone has, so it's important. Humanize you, that's a very important part. So again, the middle is where you lay it all out on the line, you deliver the climax, the most important part, and then the very end of your speech, the very end of your story is the end. And the important thing with the end is where you have to tie everything you just talked about in a bow. People like a definitive end to things, so they can understand, one, that the story's over and that there was a completed thought. If the listener can follow along with you and know that the story is ending, that is perfect. One tendency I tend to employ, one idea I tend to employ, something called a callback. A callback is where you use a metaphor or an analogy or a story or a character or something that you mentioned previously in the beginning part of your speech, and then you reflect back on it at the very end. It's a very easy way to say, all right, we've come full circle, we've now understood what this is, and it allows the reader to basically realize, okay, we've reached the end of what we're trying to talk about, and this is the idea that we're trying to get across. Because open endings are awful. No one likes it when things end abruptly or that questions are left unanswered. And I was trying to think, what's a really good example of a story that left its ending with an open ending with plenty of questions that caused people to freak out and get angry with it. And it was pretty simple because it did the same to me. Think of Lost, for instance. All the unanswered questions at the end of Lost. How does that make you feel when you're the finale of that story and they left a whole wide range of questions completely unanswered? It does not leave a very good taste in your mouth. And when you're ending a story, you want the people to think, oh, that was good, that was great. You don't want to leave people thinking, well, I wish they had talked about this, or you mentioned something in the beginning and then you never mentioned it again. Because what we're really talking about here, what we're really discussing is this idea of taking the listener on a journey. And you'll notice with this picture I'm showing right here, there is only one road in this story. And that's a very important part when you're developing your science story, to talk to somebody, to talk to listeners, to not try and overdo the amount of points you are trying to make. Keep it simple. If you add too much into a story, you're more likely not to give any of your points justice, and you're going to lead people to this idea that they don't fully understand one of the points, and because of that, they're going to turn off and they're not going to pay attention to what you're trying to talk afterwards. I know I've done that on occasion as well. And the other thing is that you have to make this journey fun. You have to lay out the road for the public or your audience to follow along. Now, ideally, it's a kind of a counterintuitive thing. You want your conclusion, you want your main point to be surprising, but also obvious. Now, that may not make much sense, but think about it. You want people to look back at your talk and think, oh, I can definitely see where he or she got there. You want them to say, oh, that makes sense. When they would think back over everything you've already just said and then can come to the conclusion themselves. If they can see how you got to your conclusion, they're much more likely to remember it in their own head, as opposed to just basically saying, here's my conclusion, these facts, these facts, these facts, these facts. You want people to basically follow along with your talk, be able to follow along logically to come to the conclusion on their own. It's a kind of like the teaching a man to fish analogy. If you can help them come to the same conclusion that you want them to do, they're much more likely to come to remember that your story for weeks, months, and years afterwards. So, seems easy enough, but what are some ways that we can actually relate to the readers? And one of the primary ways you can do this inside your own talk is through analogies and metaphors. And this is just a couple of examples I've done before where I've tapped into people's normal experiences. This is an analogy I did talking about why climate change leads to heavier rainfall. I said it's like basically upgrading from a medium to a large soda at a movie theater. Everyone has been there and realized how huge sodas are. Another example, I was talking about this idea of bad science leading to the naming of very famous diseases. This is the idea of bad air. It is not exactly truthful for why this disease was spread, but it led to the naming of it as the name called malaria, bad air, malaria, and I used the spoof of a lecture company to do so. These are very powerful ways, basically, if you can use something that reminds people of something, their experiences, you can make the connection. They're much more likely to relate to what you're going to say and remember it afterwards. If they look at a soda, they might remember, oh, that climate change thing that someone talked about once. Now, also, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about this idea of humor in your talks. Humor is a very, very powerful way of forming a natural connection and making your talk interesting so people will listen to you. But be careful. Bad humor can do the exact opposite. If it comes across as being very forced, it's not going to be helpful in terms of you can turn off an audience as well. Now, this could be somewhat scary if you don't find yourself very funny. I've also oftentimes with certain subjects have had trouble thinking of a way of describing this, and I would like to throw at least some humor into the situation. Luckily, there's an easy way that you can focus but to not have to worry about this. One, focus on analogies if you don't find that you don't find yourself, you don't want to do humor. Focus on analogies or focus on life stories. People also react really well to life stories about yourself. Or at the very worst, you can outsource your humor. And actually, the Union of Concerned Scientists has a really great source for outsourcing humors, cartoons. People love cartoons. I love cartoons. These are some of my favorite cartoons that I've used in talks before. They're funny because cartoon people tend to be funny, and these things always tend to go over well. And generally speaking, the cartoons are made broad enough where you can apply them to very specific situations in your talk, and that basically kind of hammers home how common this experience is. And again, it can relate to a wide variety of things. That's one of my favorite cartoons. That's another one of my favorite cartoons. And again, in the end, the key point to think about when you're crafting your talk is that your talk is not about getting your audience to understand the science at your level. For instance, I barely understand my science at times at my own level. It's basically to develop a respect for what you do, and for the audience to understand your impacts, your values, and the consequences of your research. Remember, it took you years and years and years to fully grasp what your field of study is. You cannot expect your audience to grasp it in a 10-minute talk. It's just not possible. So the idea here is you have to keep it simple. You have to focus on a couple of core ideas, and you have to relate to the audience's experience, relate to where they're coming from. If you can relate what you're trying to talk to what your audience's experiences are, to what the audience's background is, you're much more likely to come to a level where they actually understand what you're talking about. Not only that, but remember about it and are interested at the very end. And remember, this is a very simple thing to get, but very hard to master. So you have to practice this. So you have to write speeches. You have to practice them in front of your friends and then practice them again and go through this and iterate through these talks a little bit, because oftentimes we write a lot more than we really need to. You have to basically focus on exactly what you're trying to do. So it can be fun. It's not an innate skill, so don't worry about it if you don't think you're very good at it, and work at it. And those are the most important things when you're talking about a story. Work at it and practice. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was absolutely fantastic and definitely quite inclusive of a lot of the really important topics that we're trying to address in this webinar. We'll open it up for some initial questions so that we don't lose anything that's right on your mind right now before we move to Callan. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask of Tom, feel free to use the chat window to ask those types of questions, and I will be happy to read them out to the audience and then make sure have Tom respond in short order. So if there are any questions, please feel free to add one in that chat window. Tom, I have a couple of questions here for you. Let's see here. Let's start with Kristen Davis asks, where do you find science cartoons? I've sometimes tried to do Google searches for them and have not been very successful. What are your thoughts on that, Tom?
The Union of Concerned Scientists has a really good, every year they have, or every other year, or whatever, generally speaking, roughly every year they have a cartoon contest where they asked cartoonists to send in their best science cartoons. And I find that has been a very, very useful source for me. So you can search for Union Concerned Scientists and science cartoons, and that might be a little bit easier as opposed to just kind of doing cartoon science on the internet. And at least that's where I found those two slides and cartoons that I used for this talk.
That's great, Tom. Another question from Stephen in Oregon is that they use too many words, and they seem appropriate at the moment, but it doesn't really work overall. How do you stop using so many words?
I talk a lot, and I write a lot, and I have to. When I'm developing a talk, I write out exactly everything I think I should say the first time, and then I go through it, and I cut out roughly half of it. And that's basically the key here is it's to keep it simple, and it's to not use too much words. And I would go through a talk a bunch of different times and kind of realize, uh-oh, I'm digressing here. Uh-oh, this is not the key point I'm trying to make. And one easy way to do that is to write at the very beginning of your talk, if you're writing it down, is to write about what is the key point you want the person to leave with. What is that key point? And then if you're going through your talk and you think you're being wordy or whatnot, look through everything and realize, all right, does this help me get to the level of where my audience will get to that key point? And if it does not, it's superfluous. It's an easy way of just kind of cutting out language for what you're trying to talk about. Because while we think a lot of things may be interesting to our science, for the most part, if you're new to that science, if you're new to understanding it, it's hard to take it all in at one time.
Very, very helpful. And Christy asks, I made a joke in the beginning of a short presentation that fell flat. Has that happened to you before, and how did you recover?
Yes, I've told many jokes that have fallen flat before. And I can completely understand this, especially if you're giving a talk and you make a joke at the beginning and it falls flat. You're like, uh-oh. Well, this is not a good way of starting with it, which is kind of the idea of why humor can be dangerous. It's just to plow through. You may not realize that maybe the audience doesn't react to your joke the way you want them to, but that's fine. Just keep going through it and realize not everything is going to work out great. And you can even somewhat, if depending on how quick you are, you can make a joke like, well, you realize, oh, I know that was a pretty bad joke. And then you can basically, if you laugh at yourself about if it was a bad joke, then you're much more likely to not lose the audience that way because you at least recognize that it was a bad joke or whatnot. It actually could be a very easy way of humanizing you to an audience because you recognize you showed a fault at the very beginning and you've overcome it and you show the ability to laugh at yourself and then to keep going. But sometimes jokes don't work, so sometimes you just have to keep going through them and not have to worry about it.
Great point. And I think this will be our last question before we move on to Kellen. We'll have more time for questions at the end. But Tom, the notion of, this is from Diane, the notion of telling a simple story along a single yellow brick road and tie it up with a bow seems to be in conflict with the idea of honestly communicating about scientific uncertainty. Do you have any thoughts on how to be both honest and engaging?
That's a very good question. When I've given a bunch of talks on how weather and weather extremes specifically change in climate change, and there's a topic that is just full of uncertainty. The whole concept of how things are going to change in the future is just full of uncertainty. So there is a way where you can communicate that in a way that is not only a story but is true to your science. It's not easy, and I will note that communicating uncertainty is something, as a meteorologist, we've been trying to do for forever, and it's still a difficult thing. How often how many people understand what a 70% chance of rain actually means, for instance? So it's not that it's dishonest when you're telling a story. It's you can, in your story, you can use that to build tension. You can use this idea that there is uncertainty. You can say how that can constrain things, how that can make your researching this not as clear as you want it to be, and do it justice. I would not say you don't have to completely disregard uncertainty when you're talking about a story, but you can weave it into the narrative of what you're trying to talk about at a given time that might give a little bit more understanding to the journey that you're doing as a scientist to figure out the answer. I feel like this idea of uncertainty is important, is critical to that journey to begin with. So I would agree. You don't want to just completely lose the uncertainty. You have to weave it into your talk. But I don't think it's just doing a story means you have to completely get rid of it. The idea of uncertainty in a talk.
Thank you so much, Tom. I really appreciate that. And thank you to the participants who asked those really great questions. Next, we are off to speak with Kellen Marshall. Kellen's going to be speaking about communicating science, sharing is caring. Kellen, take it away.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kellen Marshall, and I am from the University of Illinois at Chicago. I'm a doctoral candidate, and I'm so happy to be sharing with you all today a little bit of what it is that has helped me in communicating science with many different audiences. So here we go. Next. I found this slide, and I thought it was really interesting how society views scientists and our contribution to society. So the red arrow points to us, where 65% believe that we contribute a lot, 23% believe some, and then 8% believe, not very much. And a part of this, I feel, contributes to how people think about what it is that we do based on how we communicate. So are we effective at what it is that we're doing, how important it is to society, and what is it that we can do moving forward that we can better communicate our science so that people feel that we are beneficial to society, primarily because we are, and apparently much more so than lawyers. Next. So some of this and some of my conversation is going to be addressing how we are seen as scientists and how we interact with the audience. And when we say audience, or when I say audience, it represents the many different audiences that we present our information to. But when you think about science and scientists or mathematicians or engineers, the first thing that pops into someone's mind is academia or researchers. And institutions are seen as very unapproachable, very, not allowing for people to interact with, and almost as though we look down on people. So some of what it is that we're experiencing in our communication with the audience is this framework of how they see us in the first place and where we come from. Even though we work in many different disciplines, whether that's government or many different areas, government, nonprofit, or even if we're in academia or even consulting, the way that scientists are perceived is through institutions and academia at most times. Next. So how is it that this war between us and how we want to be perceived in our information that we know is important for people to make better decisions? I myself, as an ecologist, work very closely with people within urban agriculture and understanding composting and sustainable methods in agriculture. But how I deliver that information can be the difference between somebody accepting it and moving forward with it, or looking at me and saying, well, I now have to get more information on what it is that you just said because I don't understand. So what I'm going to be doing is giving you all some tips on how it is that you fight this perception of science and scientists are unapproachable. So the first thing is, how do we see ourselves? Many of us will think that we're curious, we're problem solvers, that our science is important. It might be basic, it might be applied, and we feel that no matter how small that piece that we've dedicated our lives to, that it has a place in society. And we don't know where it's going to end up, but we know that it's valuable. We know that it needs to be funded. We know that it needs to be ongoing, and we know that other fields of science may need it someday. Next. But this is how society may see us, depending on what it is that we're studying. Mad scientists. For example, people working with GMOs might be seen as not contributing to society and making things worse in comparison to scientists that deal with curing cancer. Next. And I love this quote of, I want people to welcome science into their lives, which is very, very different than I want to share my research. And a little bit later, we're going to talk about, or I'm going to share with you my insight about the place we are in as scientists when we share. Sometimes we share from a place of it's about us. It's about our research. It's about advancing, the conversation. And it's almost, it can be seen as being very condescending and somewhat boastful. But this quote I've taken into how I communicate. I want people to welcome science into their lives. So I don't want to shove it down their throat, and it's not about me and my research, but I really want to find a way to connect it to something that relates to them, which is my audience. Next. So for many of the people that we talk to, they have no clue of the connections that we're trying to make. They don't know how it's connected to their livelihood or their well-being. They're unsure of why it is that they should care. I mean, they honestly look at us crazy because we care about something, and we spend countless hours, in the lab or in the field working on these questions and on these problems. So it is our job to connect the dots for them because they're very confused. And I like that Tom highlighted humanizing it to discuss our confusion and being able to share with them how it is that we've come through these questions, through these problems, and letting them know we hit a lot of walls in our research to get to the next level. So we at times begin at this very same point of confusion and having to connect the dots ourselves. Next. But there is an effective way of connecting the dots and an ineffective way of connecting the dots. What we don't want to do is travel our audience all around this path with no clear direction. Often audiences will leave and the major point has missed them. And this is because we have not been effective in taking them from point A to point B. Next. So our audience. Often, well, because I am in graduate school, most of my audiences have been undergraduate students. But in my personal life, when I go share science with students, they might be high school students, they might be grammar school students, kind of getting them excited in STEM, I have to even look at, well, where do these students come from? What cultural community do they come from? What are their ages? Sometimes I go speak at churches on climate change, and that's different for, my conversation is very different from one church to another church because of religion. There also might be a difference between how I speak to professionals that are within the business industry versus nonprofit organizations. So your audience absolutely matters when you are communicating your science, because what you're doing, you're giving the same information, you are just packaging it very differently. Next. So some of the things I highlighted in understanding the demographics of your population, you might be able to gauge their interest. For example, if this is something that they selected to attend, maybe it's a seminar or a talk or a webinar such as this, they obviously are interested, versus an audience where you were a speaker brought in and they don't know what to expect. I think the environment is absolutely important. Often we lecture and we stand there and we talk at people. So if you think about being more engaging with your audience, maybe changing, if you have the ability to change the structure of the room, making it more inclusive so that it's a circle. Often there are opportunities to get outside. So there's something called walk-in talks, where you take a walk and you stop at a point and you give some of your information. You continue the walk and allow people to have these small conversations, and you stop at another point and give more information. that allows people to move around, enjoy the environment, possibly share other side conversations, and they're more engaged. I guess my point with this slide with environment is be a little creative, if possible, in how it is that you create the space for you to share your information, which often can be customized. And then you also have to consider the needs of the audience. Well, what is the purpose for you going there? Does this have anything to do with policy? Does this have anything to do with a decision that they have to make? And making sure that you're packaging it in a way that is more digestible for that audience. And that will definitely differ from audience to audience. Next. So in being sensitive to where your audience is, I gave a talk at Ecological Society of America a few summers ago about the messenger matters. And it means the talk was basically helping people understand how we deliver our message can make an impact. But we have to understand where our people are. And often we don't recognize some of the sensitivities of our audience, that they might very well be scared. So when we talk about climate change and issues of climate change, people hear words like air pollution. They hear, urban heat island and asthma attacks. They hear, more people suffering. So they may very well be in a place of they're already afraid. And when we share our information, it might make them tune completely out or increase their fear. So you have to be sensitive, and I don't want to say have to, but it has helped me in communicating my science to the public to kind of feel where this audience is, so that sometimes a joke can lighten the mood, and sometimes more serious statistics can get people on, perched on the edge of their seat. Next. Or this is how some of our undergraduates look, completely disinterested. So this is where you're going to have to figure out, well, how do you energize the audience over something that might not necessarily be closely related to them? I like to use what I call the act local, think global. So making connections to things that are more relevant and more present. Sometimes those are current events, local issues, and then you kind of string them along to get them interested. You show them that they have some skin in the game, and then you relate it to the big picture of your work. Now, this might be more challenging for some than others, but I found that I've been able to energize the audience by addressing or discussing some local connections and then connecting it to my work. And it's appreciated, too, because then they realize that I'm in the room with them, and I'm not there just to give them my information, that this is a listening and sharing, and I've taken the time to understand, their local system. And I keep using local system and words like that because as an ecologist, I, study nature and cities. So when I come to a new city, I make sure that I know some quick facts about where I am, just so that I can relate to those that are hosting me. Next. Or you could have an audience that's absolutely irate already because the issue is such a hot topic. And you may walk into the room as a researcher. Your research is, obviously non-biased, but they think you're biased because of the angle that you are studying, and they're angry. So how is it that you de-escalate the situation? This one I haven't dealt with because I have not had to, I don't work with within, any science or research where the audience seems to be that hostile. But some things that come to mind are stem cell research, GMOs, and climate change, especially when you talk about oil and oil exploration. The Keystone Pipeline in the Midwest has been, those meetings and talks have been very hostile. So you have to know where your audience is and how it is that you can come in so that you can be a little bit more effective in delivering your message. Next. So this sounds like a lot, and what can I do? And I remember when I got into graduate school, I felt so confident that I knew how to talk to people. I was a mover and a shaker. I had lots of friends. But over a period of time, my training and my immersion in science at the doctoral level removed all of my skills to communicate effectively with the public. So I had to relearn these. And I share that with you to say that no matter where you are in how you communicate, that if you put in the work to do better, you absolutely will become more and more effective. So not only have I used them, but I've used them and they've worked for me. Next. So as Tom, expressed numerous times, keeping it simple. And there was a question that was lifted up, about complexity. And the one thing I think about is, does your audience necessarily need to know the complex things in order for them to get the takeaway message? Sometimes not. So keeping it simple may mean that you leave out jargon, for example. You find another way of saying things. Keeping it simple may mean that instead of you using the figure that you got published in a journal, you adjust that image to be a little bit more public friendly. Next. And when I saw this from Albert Einstein, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough, I would say it would be the audience. Sometimes you can keep complexity and retain complexity because it adds to the richness of the conversation for that audience, and it's appropriate. However, sometimes it's not appropriate depending on your audience. Next. So don't be condescending. And often we don't know how that is perceived because our intentions are to share. But it could be the tone of your voice. It could be how you move around the room or making eye contact. It could be a number of things of just you in the space with the other people. And we're already seen as being arrogant simply because of, we're scientists. And sometimes people have had negative experiences with scientists. The one scientist that we have the most experience with in our lifetime are medical doctors. So you have to think, if people are having bad experiences with very arrogant, doctors, that they have created this perception of arrogance for all of us, which might not necessarily be true. So using the tools of your personality and allowing your personality to shine through may very well eliminate some of that perception. Next. The consequences to this very subtle arrogance or this invisible arrogance that some of us may possess is that they don't get the message. They have completely tuned out. They're not interested in listening to us. So what was the purpose of us being there? Next. The next tip is to tell stories. And Tom gave some wonderful, wonderful highlights on what this looks like. And storytelling is one of these crafts that everybody has. I mean, you tell stories around the dinner table. You tell stories about your day. And you give it energy. You give it life. You give it humor. You use your facial expressions, your body moves. You're in it. You take people from the beginning, the middle, and to the end, and they feel like they were there. We don't do that when we give our talks. Like we give a talk. We don't tell a story. So if you ever have an opportunity to practice this, I strongly encourage you, like for example at professional meetings, you might have the chance to do what's called a speed talk, or you might adopt a storytelling method to deliver your paper or your talk. The tools needed are, that were expressed in the previous slides are absolutely useful. And again, the more you practice it, the better you become. And this applies to all audiences. I have not mastered telling stories with my undergrads to keep them that engaged though. Next. So the other thing is when you're telling your stories, still, if you're not speaking to your peers, our technical jargon is gobbledygook. They do not understand it, and you have to also consider what I call the economy of language. How can you be most effective giving the information without using super large technical words? And you want to get to the point. You want to give it to them so that they understand. You want to give it to them so that they're not feeling like insulted. But you also want to be able to move on to the next point. So that's where economy of language becomes so very important. Next. The use of illustrations and images. I can't stress enough, like if we're giving talks or if you are giving a talk, the imagery behind you is extremely important. When you're communicating using slides, it is a backup. I often use going to a concert, for example. Like James Brown is the main act. He's dancing and he's moving around the floor and he's doing his splits. And what brings it all to life are his backup dancers and his band. These slides are the backup dancers and the band. You can use them effectively by using imagery. Sometimes it can be funny. Sometimes it can just be art. You know, you can be creative with these slides without compromising the integrity of your research. Next. Lastly, I have always had a passion for media, television, film, radio, and journalism. And I have constantly been drawn to communicating science. So recently I began a web series called Living Chicago. This project has really, put my feet to the fire for holding me accountable for the tools and the tips that I've shared with you. When I produce a story, sometimes I have to produce it twice because the first time is for me, because this is what I want to see on television. This is what I think is interesting. And then when I look at it again, or I look at it with my children, or I look at it with my mother, they're not as interested. They're not as excited. It's not until I remove my ego from those productions that the real communication for the audience begins. So just as Tom suggested, writing down, before and then going back, sometimes I do the exact same thing using video. But the fun part has been learning what the audience wants to hear. Sometimes we can forget that while we're in our research with all of this information to share, there's also something to be said for what the audience wants to hear. And sometimes you can get them by addressing that need. And if you have a relationship, for example, with an organization and you're going and you're giving talks or you want to reach out to their audiences and make yourself available to talk about your research, sometimes you can get buy-in by simply making yourself available to speak and connect and share science information that's not even related to your research. This way you're building and cultivating relationships with a particular audience that you can continue to practice these tools with. Now, it might not be related to your research, but you're still getting the experience of communicating science in an effective way. And I've learned that through listening and listening to what people want and listening to the science needs or the science questions that people have. Answering those, it helps me become more effective in providing information of what it is that I'm really interested in that I want them to understand. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that was a really, really helpful conversation, Helen, and I think you definitely covered quite a lot of topics that will be great for questions. As you can see on our slide, we now have some expanded time for questions and answers by both Helen and Tom. So if you have questions, please put them there in that chat window on the bottom left of your screen, and I'll be happy to read them out and give them to our presenters. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to type them now. A question from Jessica. of Oregon. What are the best strategies to figure out how to make your science sound interesting and engaging, but not dumbed down? Kellen, do you want to try to take a stab at that?
Sure. So I guess for me, the first thing is I love what I do. I'm not bored with what I do. And if you work in a lab, it could be quite challenging to get people to be connected to it. But if there's any way that you can connect it to something familiar, sometimes using, like I said, current events. Maybe it is connecting it to a megafauna, an animal or a place. Asking people to, relate to a movie or something of that nature. Finding something that might be common and tying it to your work. Helping them using what I call an anchor, like anchor them in something that's public or something that's popular, and then bring them out.
Great response. And kind of following up in that space, Rafat asks, how do you manage simplicity before it starts to offend people and could become insulting?
Well, I think that's where knowing your audience becomes so important. You wouldn't want to speak to a group of masters holders, as you would a group of kindergartners. So that's where you have to be very clear on who it is that you're speaking to, so you won't do that. Now, you also sometimes I'll throw in more advanced things, and if I read the audience, I know what to skip over and what to go into a little bit more depth. So the bonus of being able to have visuals is that you have this kind of you have what in a sense like a small, medium, large. Like you don't have to do one size fits all. You can add content in there that you can gloss over, that you can go further into, or that you can just make no mention of and just move along.
Another question from Christy. What is the best way to present data without losing the non-science audience? Is it graphs? Is it infographics? Kellen or Tom, either of you which would like to respond to that one.
So Tom, I'll let you take this one.
Sure. Kellen brings up very excellent points about knowing your audience, and that is important. It depends on what audience you're talking about. I will say this: when I that example of me giving that climate change and weather extremes talk to that tech-oriented crowd, I talked for 15 minutes and I did not have a single graph or scientific figure in my talk. I just basically got rid of all of them. And it wasn't like I was dumbing it down for them. I just felt like it's oftentimes it just kind of bogs down your presentation. And for the most part, you can get across the point of your graph without actually using the graph. And then in which case, the graph is only going to add confusion. So it might be easier oftentimes, I find, to just say what the graph was supposed to say. For instance, I was trying to indicate sea level rise, and there's obviously a bunch of graphs that can show sea level increasing, but instead I basically just put a giant arrow pointing up, and I wrote sea level rise. I got the exact same point across, because for the most part, the super specifics of what your graph is trying to say is not necessarily the important point of that graph. I would say, depending on your audience, if it's obviously a scientific audience, you're going to want to have at least some graphs on there. You're going to want to try and keep them simple. You're going to want to try and keep them one to a slide. You're going to try and keep them so that they're not overwhelmingly data dense. But for the most part, when you're talking to, let's say I would call it an NPR-esque audience, I normally try to get rid of all the graphs I can possibly have in the talk and just get right to the point of what those graphs were going to say anyway.
Great. Thank you, Tom. I think that's pretty important as well. As a nuclear engineer, sometimes I found that the more graphs, the more sleep tends to be the style. So I definitely can agree with that sentiment. I understand another question from Rick. He understands that the scientist would not want to come across as arrogant or unapproachable, but also wants to convey to the audience the expertise in a given field. How do you instill an appreciation for your authority in a topic without appearing arrogant? Either Tom or Kellen, whichever you'd like to respond to this one.
Well, a part of me feels like people's perception of us, is some of their own thing. Like, we can't control it. You obviously are the authority on it because you are at the front of the room and they are not. Now, whether they respect what you are saying also is, a personal choice. So being authoritative and sharing your information, I think is enough. I've never been attacked or had the feeling of somebody questioning my authority outside of the scientific community. And maybe it's because of the science that it is that I do, that, ecology and nature and animals and bugs seem very, approachable. But I can imagine if you're in a room with people that already don't necessarily respect the science that you do, that it could be, a challenge. I'm not quite sure, how do you, change people's perception of you in one talk? The best advice that I could give is to retain your, authority by sharing your information in a way that's respectful and not argumentative. And if someone becomes argumentative, arguing back doesn't necessarily make you the expert. What makes you the expert is you have the information, and that's the only difference. But each of you has an opinion.
Thank you so much for that, Kellen. I think that's actually the exact way we're going to end this webinar, is that it's not the argument that makes you the expert, it's the knowledge that you bring to the table. But you have to be able to communicate that knowledge in a supportive and literal and responsive manner. So I really appreciate that response. So we are going to wrap this webinar up, but first we want to give you a few chances to know what you can do next. One of those ways that you can be involved is in coordination with the Science Network. I am the executive director of an organization called the National Science Policy Group, NSPG. The National Science Policy Group works to connect students from across the country, PhD students like Kellen and undergraduate students across the spectrum. All of those students come together to figure out ways that they can have science policy conversations on their own campus. If you are interested in learning more about that, feel free to go to the website that was just put on the link in the chat window, natscipolgroup.org. You can learn more about it. You can also contact us to find either a chapter at your school or connect your current science policy group to us so that you can all be on one big connection. We have over 50 universities represented, so if you want to know how to get science policy conversations started on your campus, we are the way that you can do that. And we'd be happy to help you with that space. I'll turn it over to Melissa to wrap us up and provide a few other opportunities that are specific to the Science Network. Melissa, why don't you take over?
Great, thank you. Again, my name is Melissa. I'm the community manager for the Science Network at UCS. Just wanted to share with you a couple ways you can stay in touch with us and put your skills into practice. So we are looking for guest bloggers for the Science Network Voices on the Equation. A lot of the science communication skills that Tom and Kellen shared today are totally transferable to writing a guest blog, turning it into a narrative and sharing your story. So if you're interested, please fill out the survey after the webinar and let us know, what you would like to write about, and we'll be in touch. Our next webinar is on December 1st. It's with Randy Olson, and so make sure you are able to register for that through the website if you haven't already. And finally, just stay in touch with us on Twitter, on our website, through email, or if you're going to the American Geophysical Union Fall Meeting, we will be there in mid-December. So with that, I'd like to thank you for joining us. We will be sending around the recording of the webinar, and you can always watch our past recordings on the Science Network Workshops webpage on the screen right there. So thank you again for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.